No kid's Jewish education should end at 13. UNRWA offers Ontario high school credits infused with Jewish learning online for teens across the province. Ministry approved, intellectually demanding, Jewishly transformative. UNRWA.ca. Your teen belongs here.
Canada will be voting in favor of this resolution today. We will be voting yes. Because of the urgent need.
That's what it sounded like in New York 7 months ago, in June, when Bob Rae, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, told the General Assembly why our country was voting yes to a motion calling for a permanent ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. It also criticized Israel's blockade of humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, while, to be fair, it also condemned Hamas and called for a two-state solution. Some Canadian Jewish leaders criticized this yes vote. They called it more evidence that Canada was departing from our country's long-standing support of the Israeli government and instead has been taking a harder stance since October 7th. Canadian Jewish political advocacy group CJA, for example, called the vote one-sided against Israel, a reward for Hamas that undermines peace. This pushback from home is a scenario that Bob Rae acknowledges he's experienced more than once during his 5-year posting as Canada's permanent envoy to the United Nations headquarters, a posting which just ended a few weeks ago after the fall session saw Canada officially recognize the Palestinian state. Again, observers say, a departure from former policy, which until then had called for recognition only after conditions were met, including a negotiated settlement between Israel and the Palestinians. But Rae says, despite the criticism he's received on the Middle East file, both because of his diplomatic job but also in his private life, he wholeheartedly supports Canada's new approach. And he doesn't buy what Israel and some in the Jewish community are saying, that the UN spends an inordinate amount of time and effort focused on condemning Israel. In fact, he believes Israel has more support now at the UN body than it used to. Since he returned to Canada, Rae's been speaking out in media interviews about the state of the world now, threats from U.S. President Donald Trump, other global conflicts and climate change, and the rise of nationalism and strongmen. We've long wanted to talk to him about Canada's record on the Israel-Hamas war and the treatment of the Palestinians, Canada's support for UNRWA, and other parts of the story in what you could argue is the most polarizing issue internationally in recent years. So now, in his first news interview with the CJN since 2022, Rae explains why he thinks Canada is taking the right approach. He talks about what he regrets he couldn't do at the UN and what his stance has cost him personally.
The premise of the position that Mr. Harper, first of all, Mr. Martin and then Mr. Harper took in changing some votes and saying, we're not going to vote. We're going to either abstain or vote no on resolutions because we think the parties should negotiate 2 states. And we don't want to keep passing these resolutions that are going to get in the way of that decision. Well, that's true. In one context, you say, okay, that's right. But when the context completely changes and you have a government in Israel that says, we don't want 2 states, there'll never be 2 states. You say, well, are we going to say, okay, we're just going to keep quiet about that? I don't think we can.
I'm Ellen Besner, and this is what Jewish Canada sounds like from Monday, February 3rd, 2026. Welcome to North Star, the flagship podcast of the Canadian Jewish News, made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Gronowski-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. The Honourable Bob Rae is a former NDP Premier of Ontario and a longtime Member of Parliament, including leader of the Federal Liberal Party. And before Justin Trudeau appointed him as Canada's envoy to the UN in 2020, Rae oversaw several refugee crises, including the Rohingyas. When he moved to New York right after the outbreak of the pandemic, he subsequently helped shape international decisions on many issues like COVID, the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Iran, and other genocides, including the Uyghurs by China. His duties ended in mid-November, just before Canada supported another slew of motions critical of Israel's actions. Rae himself has Jewish heritage. His grandfather was born Goodman Cohen, although Rae is not of the Jewish faith, but his wife is, so are their 3 daughters, and Rae considers himself part of the Jewish community, which he admits has also made him the target of anti-Semitism, whose recent resurgence here at home and around the world Ray calls the biggest tragedy coming after October 7th. Ray and I sat down for a wide-ranging discussion, first about the UN in general and his Jewish ties, and Trump, and then we get into the Middle East, Israel, Gaza, UNRWA, and whether he considers what happened in Gaza a genocide. He joins me now from his Toronto home office.
Nice to see you, Alan. Nice to be back in town.
And not in warmer climes where we last met. Speaking of New York, I wanted to ask you, you were recently making a speech this week, and the speech was using a Jewish, very famous saying from Pirkei Avot. Your speech was about the rapids. We're in the rapids, but you used Hillel in English. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, what am I? Why did that saying speak to you as a way to describe what Canada and Canadians need to do to navigate this new world with Trump and wars and protectionism, tariffs, etc.?
Well, I actually wrote a book called The Three Questions back in the 90s, which was a book about Canadian public policy and policy in the world, and also how we should conduct our own lives. So Hillel's quotation has stayed with me for a very long time. In fact, I used it for the first time in the first speech I gave in the House of Commons in 1978. So this is not a new moment for me to use that line. And I think it speaks very much to my problem with saying I'm for America first. And you say, yeah, of course, I'm for Canada first. So you're for America first. So that's okay. But then we got to take the next two questions, which is you can't just be for yourself. You cannot just only be for yourself. You have to recognize that you can't ask others to do things for you if you're not prepared to put yourself forward. That's understood. But then that's not enough to live a good life and to have good relationships with other people. And I think that saying has stayed with me for a long time, and I use it a lot because I think it's very apt. I've used it from the podium of the United Nations that say it isn't enough for us to just be for ourselves. We have to look and see what else we can do for others. And then we have to look for the need for action, which I think is the point of the third question.
There's so much to unpack with that, but let's talk about the multi-country cooperation ethos, which when you were born was in 1948, right after the Second World War, when this sort of whole, let's never have that happen again. We made the United Nations and other institutions to make sure that would never happen. And now you have become critical publicly of the dysfunction that what the UN was supposed to do, it's not happening now. What is the role of the United Nations as it's in its 80th year now? Is there still a role?
Oh, I think there is. But I think the challenge for the UN is that it's only as strong as its members. And as you know, one of the central flaws, in my opinion, in the design of the UN is that the 5 countries that came out of the Second World War feeling that they were the victors, they led the campaign against the Nazis and against the Japanese Empire, and therefore they gave themselves vetoes in the Security Council over issues of peace and security. So I think when you look at the challenges facing the world, the problem facing the UN is that it's not the UN itself. So I think the major contribution the UN has made since 1945 is to have been able to guide and preside over the literal transformation of the world. When the UN was created, there were only 51 members, and now there's 193. For the most part, colonization is over, although there's still some reverberations of that mentality that one sees in the world. But I think the big strength of the UN is the work of its agencies, the work that it undertakes in countries around the world attempting to coordinate development and coordinate the kind of responses to humanitarian crises, which are increasing in number. But the weakness of the UN not only is in this veto situation, but the weakness is also that the UN can only do what member states are willing to pay for. And we at the moment have a financial problem facing the UN, which is a very serious one, because many member states are not paying up, or they're paying much less.
President Trump in September told the UN that what is the purpose, quoting him, it's such potential, but it's not even coming close. They only have words and letters and they never follow up. Do you agree with him at all?
No, I don't agree with him at all. I'll tell you why, because the United States has reneged on its role as an important funder of the United Nations. And so then he says, well, it's very weak. And you say, well, it's weak because you've made it weak. The United States is systematically weakening the capacity of the United Nations to respond to anything. Peacekeeping or any forms of intervention, humanitarian intervention, what Mr. Carney the other day referred to as a rupture. One of the big ruptures that's taken place is the rupture between the United States and the United Nations. And so the country that causes the rupture and then pulls all the funding away can't very well, say you're a weak organization. It's like the old joke about the kid who kills his parents and then goes to the court and says, please help me, I'm an orphan.
My grandfather used to tell that joke a lot about chutzpah,
well,
exactly.
Look, your grandfather was right. No country has done more to undermine in the last 5 years, or 3 years, to undermine the capacity of the United Nations than the United States of America. It's a very sad thing. Obviously, Russia's driven a tank through the ability of the UN to respond to the terrible aggression that's taken place in Ukraine. But I don't think we really fully get or appreciate to what extent what the United States started to do with the onset of the latest Trump administration, and even the after effects of what the Trump administration did in its first term to really seriously weaken the capacity of the UN, and frankly, to weaken the influence that the United States is able to have on what happens globally. The United States is not making America great again. The United States is making America weaker.
When you talk about UN agencies having an important role, we need to talk about UNRWA, of course, and that's part of the reason why the United States did not want to have anything to do with that funding that agency. Many Canadian Jews would agree that it is egregious that the Canadian government supported UNRWA and continues to do so even this past week with a strongly worded international statement saying UNRWA should continue its important work in Gaza and the West Bank. So as ambassador, you had to do what Global Affairs decided on UNRWA. How do you now, not that you don't have the sort of muzzle on you, how do you feel that the support of UNRWA by the United Nations and by Canada played out at home?
Well, I mean, you're going to be disappointed in my answer, because if you think that I was muzzled in the UN by my government about the Middle East broadly, I was never muzzled on the Middle East by my government. And at the UN, I said what I believed to be true and what I still believe to be true. I don't believe that a unilateral defunding of UNRWA helps anything. I think it has actually weakened the ability of that agency to do what it was set out to do and was intended to do and what it has been doing, which is to provide education and healthcare to the Palestinians, and frankly, in a situation where no one else was prepared to do it. The Arab countries were not prepared to fund the humanitarian needs of the Palestinians who left their homes in Israel, because they didn't want to take that issue away from being dealt with. And they felt that if we keep on providing support, if we're asked to do all the support for UNRWA, then we're going to take away our ability to say, but the Palestinians should be allowed to go home, or at least they should be compensated for what took place in 1948. That position by the Canadian government has been taken by the Saint-Laurent government, by the government of Mr. Diefenbaker, by the government of Mr. Pearson, by all the subsequent governments of Canada, including the Mulroney government that was in power for 8 years, and including the Harper government, except for one instance towards the end when they made some decisions. I don't agree with defunding UNRWA. I agreed that we needed to find out what the charges against UNRWA were, and we needed to deal with that particular situation that took place after the events of October 7th. I agreed that had to be a suspension, but I did not think there should be a long-term defunding and an end to the role of UNRWA. And the reason is very simple.
How does Canada safeguard? How does Canada safeguard the money that taxpayers are spending when there's evidence that it's used towards hostage taking and October 7th, as well as education of the people
Ellen,
killing
that's not
Jews?
True. Ellen, that's not true. You're saying things that are not true.
There's evidence that there were some employees and that the textbooks have had things that have incited hatred against Jews and glorifying terrorism, as well as people working in UNRWA buildings where the tunnels are right underneath. So I
Well, the
didn't make the
tunnels,
evidence up.
the,
It's out
you're,
there.
you're raising a lot of different issues. The first thing I want to say broadly is we had two major
It's
reviews
about
of UNRWA,
credibility of the organization, right?
but it's
Yeah.
also the credibility of your questions. And I have to say this, it doesn't help to just keep on repeating these points and not deal with the reports that have been brought in by the former French foreign minister, by the internal review that was done by the UN inspection agency, by the people that have looked hard at what took place and said, yes, there were problems. Part of the problem is that UNRWA isn't a fully funded agency in the sense that it doesn't have a great capacity to review all of the stuff that said it has to be reviewed. But you have to appreciate that UNRWA itself as an organization has never been and is not now and has never been as an organization a supporter of terrorism. UNRWA as an organization now has never been a supporter of anything that speaks against the rights of Israel to exist and the rights to be a country on its own. The fact of the matter is that UNRWA, yes, it employs a lot of Palestinians. It employs tens of thousands of Palestinians to work in the camps, to run the hospitals, to run the agencies, to run the things that have to be run. Bluntly put, the Hamas tunnels were built at the time when, and have been built over many, many years, and the whole world has a responsibility for the fact that this terrorist organization was allowed to build tunnels and able to build tunnels. But the fact you say, well, there's tunnels under the hospitals, there's tunnels under every institution in Gaza. The tunnels are
Right.
bigger than the New York subway system. And right there with Israel right next door, that's what was happening. And we now have evidence, and everybody knows this. It's not an unfair statement to make, is that the Israeli government itself asked Qatar and other countries to fund Hamas because
That's fair. That's fair.
they did, and that will only come out when
Yeah,
there
that's
is a
fair.
judicial inquiry in Israel, which one day hopefully there will be, into how things happened before October the 7th and what happened after October the 7th, and that's something that still needs to be done. I will not accept people telling me that UNRWA is a terrorist agency, as somebody said. I don't believe there's evidence that would support that statement.
You know, it's such a polarized topic here. We have this sort of moment, even or over our interview. And you once said, Canada, nobody can be neutral. Canada can't be neutral over Israel. And here we are, just as an example. I know that many Canadian Jewish people feel the United Nations has vilified Israel and made it their obsession, where there's so many other global conflicts, as you all, working on many of these other ones. Is that a fair feeling that with Canada's voting record in the last few years, that Israel is the sort of the obsession of the United Nations?
Israel is not the
Yeah, go
obsession
ahead.
of the United Nations. I mean, there are member states that feel very strongly about what's been happening there. I mean, let's look at the full spectrum. There are member states that, in their heart of hearts, wish Israel had never become a state. Canada voted in favor of the admission of Israel into the United Nations. I think there's been a tremendous evolution in the views of member states of the UN that I've seen. I mean, even the last 5 years. Countries that had previously could never bring themselves to say, we recognize the state of Israel to exist, we believe in a two-state solution, voted in favor of a two-state solution many, many times when I was sitting in my seat, having discussions with Arab ambassadors from the Gulf states, from neighboring states to Israel. And you'll find a range of views about, what should be done, what needs to be done. And I don't think it's about saying that this is a sort of singular obsession of the United Nations. I don't think that's true. It is true that the issues that have been present since 1948, since the formation of the State of Israel and the creation of many hundreds of thousands and now millions of refugees in refugee camps outside the State of Israel, that issue has been, a focus for some countries, but it's far and away from being the only focus or being the only issue. I think after the events of October 7th, which regrettably, and I really deeply regret this, we were not able to get a 2/3 majority of countries to vote for a naming of Hamas and a clear description of what took place on October the 7th. But we did get a majority of nation states to agree to it. But we needed a 2/3 majority because we were amending a motion. And I really regret that didn't happen. That was for me, one of the low points of my time at the UN. It is not true to say that there's been an unwillingness to condemn what took place. And in fact, in the last round of discussions about two states and about reinforcing the need for creating a peace process after a ceasefire, there was a direct condemnation of what Hamas did. And there was a general agreement that that was not something that could be accepted. And I think you're seeing a widespread evolution of opinion about how this goes forward. The vast majority of the nation states of the UN now support a two-state solution and support the integrity of the state of Israel. You could argue about the borders and boundaries, and that obviously is something that still has to be, in a final sense, negotiated between the parties. But there is a very profound sense of recognition on the part of the countries of the world that Israel has a right to exist. Certainly the Secretary General believes it intensely himself. Has not the least bit of an anti-Israel or anti-Zionist perspective in his bones. That's not how he thinks or what he looks at. He does believe, and I think a lot of people believe, that it has taken too long for a ceasefire to take place, and that the impact of the destruction of Gaza and the killing of tens of thousands of people, I'm not sure we'll ever know the exact number in Gaza, and the continuing activities on the West Bank, which I think people find very disturbing in terms of not only the extension of the settlements, but also the behavior of the settlers and the incredible difficulty in getting to a peaceful situation in the West Bank, a stable situation, is not right. And so it's not about sort of, are we singling out one country or another? Yes, there have been dozens of resolutions, hundreds of resolutions passed in the UN, in human rights councils, and in other bodies of the UN, but they all focus on this question of the need to get to a peaceful solution and the need to recognize that the Six-Day War didn't solve the problem, and that other conflicts have not solved the problem, and that it takes ceasefires and peaceful agreements, such as the one initiated by President Sadat when he made his trip to Jerusalem, and other steps such as that, and the recent Abraham Accords and other steps. Those have all been very positive signs. And I think people understand that. To me, the greatest tragedy of what's happened after October 7th has been the explosion of a completely unjustified and entirely wrong outburst of anti-Semitism, which we see around the world and we see in our own country, which is appalling. And it's also, in a sense, quite separate from what's taking place in the Middle East. You can't say, well, this is happening because of what the state of Israel did. You say, the state of Israel is a country. It's done this. Countries get into wars of aggression and countries do make mistakes and they do whatever they do. Criticize Israel, that's fine. But to link this to the Jewish people themselves in Canada or elsewhere is
the Holocaust,
wrong.
Nazis, everything.
The denial, everything that we've seen, the outburst of this just incredible explosion of anti-Semitism. And I think it is fair. I think it's a fair criticism to say that not enough people have really focused on how and why this is happening, and to simply say, "Oh, it's only happening because of, what Israel's done and what's happened in the Middle East." I don't think that's accurate, and I don't think it helps to solve the problem, because the problem is now everywhere, and we have to be able to deal with it everywhere. And that, I think, is something that we all need to do a better job of dealing with.
Who's behind it? Because you said it's not connected. Is it Iran? Is it Qatar, who Canada just made many economic agreements with to help us build infrastructure, which many people are raising their eyebrows about cozying up to that country, or China? Who's behind it?
Well, none of the above. I mean, when you say who's behind it, the Iranians are one of the real holdouts. I think there is a level of organization that is taking place that has to be explained. We have to know how this has come. I think it's because we're not all alone in facing it in Canada. But when you say to me, is it Qatar? I'd say absolutely not. I do think that it's important as well to understand that in its expression, anti-Semitism, as it we go through it's something that we go through eruptions with. We have eruptions of it, and it's a chronic condition that's lived that people have had to live with for over 2,000 years. And it at times it's had its roots in Christianity, in Islamic scripture. It's the same problem, where the Jews are singled out for particular awful criticism as a people. But I think now it's a way more complicated phenomenon in our country because we don't have enough real education and memory of what happened in history, and this is a general problem in Canada. And because we're such a diverse country, many people didn't necessarily go to school here. They immigrate here, and they may have their own views and their own traditions of where they come from, and think it's fine to say the things that are being said. But it is not fine. It's not okay. It's a terrible problem that we have to face up to.
Have you personally experienced anti-Semitism, being the grandson of a Jewish family and married to Jewish women with Jewish children and raised within the Jewish community?
Well, in my case, it's complicated because people don't know what I am.
Yeah.
People don't know what I am exactly. My grandfather was Jewish, and he assimilated, and his family assimilated. My grandmother was Scottish, and so on. So, but yeah, my kids are Jewish, and my wife is Jewish. So, have I personally experienced anti-Semitism? Yes.
Often, or is this a one thing you like?
No, I wouldn't say often, but I know that there are people who, in certain circumstances, would say, Bob Ray's really a Jew, and so we can't support him, or we can't vote for him, or we can't do this or that. So yes, of course, I've heard it, but I mean, I always say to people, well, I'm honored to be considered to be part of the community, and of course, I accompany my wife a lot to services, but I'm not. I am what I am. I mean, I'm I'm a Canadian, and I'm an Anglican and a whole bunch of other things, but I'm very honored to be associated with the community. So when you say, have I experienced it? Yeah, I've certainly seen it, and I've heard it. Yes, I have. I think everyone has, everyone associated with the community, everyone who's a member of the community, and everyone who's associated with the community knows what anti-Semitism is and knows how bad it is. But
let me ask you about that. After October 7th, as ambassador, Canada's positions on Israel angered a lot of people in the Jewish community, as we talked about earlier. What pushback did you personally experience, having helmed the Canadian delegation there, from the Jewish community?
Well, frankly, nothing that I wouldn't have expected, because I think the community has very, very strong feelings about the need for Canada to never say anything negative about Israel, and for Canada to be, aligned with that position.
Yeah, I think that's changed a bit, but okay, I disagree with you.
And I think, was I lobbied? Yes. Was I criticized? Yes. Have I lost friendships because of it in one or two cases? Yes. But I think the one misnomer that I want to kind of clear the air about is to say, was I forced to take decisions that I didn't agree with? And the answer is no, I wasn't. I in fact had an ongoing set of conversations with the leaders of the government, both Mr. Trudeau and Mr. Carney, about what we needed to do and where I thought the country should be in the discussions around two states, and why we had always said we were in favor of two states, and we needed to understand that we couldn't back away from that position and not vote the implications of that decision, because the government of Israel today is, the premise of the position that Mr. Harper, first of all, Mr. Martin, and then Mr. Harper took in changing some votes and saying, we're not going to vote. We're going to either abstain or vote no on resolutions because we think the parties should negotiate two states. And we don't want to keep passing these resolutions that are going to get in the way of that decision. That's true. In one context, you say, okay, that's right. But when the context completely changes and you have a government in Israel that says, we don't want two states, there'll never be two states. You say, well, are we going to say, okay, we're just going to keep quiet about that? I don't think we can. It doesn't have to be unpleasant. You will not hear me or the Canadian government saying anything unpleasant or negative about the state of Israel, about Israel's right to exist, about its right to make its own political decisions. But we need to be able to say, but we still think there should be two states. And if that puts us at odds with the government of Israel because we believe in two states, then that's too bad. That's tough. But that's the position of the government of Canada.
You were
And
personally then for the Canadian recognition of the state of Palestine unilaterally then? Yep,
yes, I
in
was.
September? Mhm.
And it's not unilaterally, excuse me.
Well, because there were conditions which then weren't met. They
The
just
Palestinian Authority, the implication of the understandings that were reached in 1993 in the Oslo Accords, stated assumption of those accords, was that the Palestinian Authority would be recognized by Israel, and the Palestinian Authority would recognize the state of Israel. And that was the beginning of making two states more real as an idea that had never been before. Canada has had diplomatic relations with the Palestinian Authority for a very long time, going back to the late 90s. We've had a diplomatic mission, first in East Jerusalem, then in Ramallah, for a very, very long time. So,
right, but in July, the Canadian Prime Minister said we're going to have spoken to the Palestinian Authority. They were going to disarm, they were going to reform, they were going to hold elections, negotiated peace. And then 4 months later, they changed their mind because the conditions changed. Is that how you're?
No,
Is that
but
how
again,
you're
Ellen,
characterizing?
I want you to focus just on what you're saying. Palestinian Authority doesn't have an army. Canadian government, and with the support of the Israeli government, has been providing security assistance to the Palestinian Authority so it can do effectively in the West Bank what it has to do. Hamas is not the Palestinian Authority. Hamas is the enemy of the Palestinian Authority. Hamas has to be disarmed. We've said Hamas should not be allowed to be armed. That's the position of the government of Canada. How this unfolds into a real two-state reality is something that we still don't know the answer to that, and how that will in fact happen. But the notion that somehow this is this recognition was, quote, unconditional or unilateral is not true. I mean, joined by a number of other countries, joined by states, all over Europe, including England and France. I mean, this is not something which the Carney government has sort of picked out of the air and said, this is what we're going to do. It's been done as a result of a serious process of thinking about how do we make it clear enough to everyone, including the government of Israel, that we're serious about two states. And frankly, that's something which I think needed to be done. And I was in favor of it. So I wasn't told what to say.
I remember reading an article. They call you Hurricane Bob, or there's some Hurricane Bob little doohickey on your desk because
yes.
you make people in global affairs on Sussex Drive pull their hair out.
I mean, I am frustrated as an individual, by the gap between the word and the deed sometimes. And, governments say they're going to do something. And there was one instance where I was quite determined to say, if you think it had nothing to do with the Middle East, it had to do with an internal matter about the UN and peace building. And I was told by everybody, well, the government won't do this. I said, I think they will. And so I pushed hard, and eventually was successful in persuading them we needed to do more in being active on issues of peace building. So that's when I got the my little badge from my friends in GAC saying, we call you Hurricane Bob.
We talked a little bit earlier about it, and following up now with Trump's Board of Peace. Some people say that it's going to try be a replacement for the UN. What do you make of this Board of Peace? And secondly, Canada was invited and disinvited. So what should we do to get on it or ignore it?
I think that the Board of Peace idea was something that, the Trump administration was very tied to. And they made it a condition to be mentioned in the Security Council resolution, which actually authorized the ceasefire, which is now technically in place, although there have been a lot of breaches of the ceasefire since that time. I think as the details of the Board of Peace have come out, there's a lot of elements in it that I think would be a concern to any government. You have to pay $1 billion if you want to be a permanent member. I don't know what that means. This is all a little bit strange in how it's structured. Whatever emerges from it, Canada will of course engage with the countries that are on it, and whatever structures are created, presumably there will be some kind of a secretariat. We'll work with them, and we want to be clear that whether we get invited or disinvited or reinvited is really irrelevant. I think it's not going to replace the UN. It's not a rival to the UN any more than NATO is a rival to the UN, and frankly, the rules of NATO are much more transparent and clear and obvious than this so-called board of peace. So it's a bit of an odd duck, and we'll just see how it unfolds in the course of discussions. But I think a lot of the talk about it as an effective, extraordinary organization and language that's used by people to describe it, and let's just see what happens. I mean, it's
so should Canada try to get back onto it, or not?
I don't think that makes a lot of sense for Canada to rush in to want to do that. I wouldn't recommend that. I've never been asked for my opinion about it, but I guess I'll tell you. You engage with it. The extent to which it's a credible organization with credible people working in it, the extent to which it's trying to improve governance in Palestine and Gaza, the extent to which it's trying to deal with those issues, you cooperate with it, you work with it. But I'm not convinced that we'll just have to see how it evolves. And if it evolves in a way that has transparency, no grifting, no grafting, no, under the table economic stuff that you don't even know what it is. These are standards we would apply to any organization which we were going to join. And so when Prime Minister Carney expressed some skepticism about, we want to make sure our money goes to assist the Palestinians directly, and we're not going to be spending $1 billion just as a membership fee. It's not a golf club. I mean, it's got to be seen as having some credibility as an organization.
All right, so we'll wait and see. Lastly, the word genocide has been used in issues that you've personally been special envoy for example, with the Rohingyas, the world. Canada has also talked about the genocide of Uyghurs. Do you believe Israel committed genocide in Gaza?
Well, that's an issue that's eventually going to go, I suspect, is going to go to the International Court of Justice, which is where it is now. And I don't think it helps for me to come up with my own personal definition of what I think happened or may be happening. I do believe that far too many civilians were killed. And that's enough for me to say that's why I supported a ceasefire almost as soon as the fighting broke out, because I didn't think anything would be accomplished in the way in which it was attempted to be accomplished. And I do think that the extent of the humanitarian destruction, the loss of life, the permanent crippling of tens of thousands of people and the deaths of over tens of thousands of people, I think is a human tragedy of enormous dimensions that everyone should be aware of. But I'm not going to get into the dictionaries or anything else. I mean, stuff happened that shouldn't have happened. That's enough for me to say it has to stop. And how courts deal with this as time goes on, only time will tell.
I'd like to know if you define yourself as a Zionist, and if so, why or why not?
It's a question that I don't quite know what it means, because people attach different things to the word. There are people who say the word means that it's attached to people who say, yes, I'm a Zionist, and that's why I believe Israel has the right to occupy the entire historic land of the people of Israel. And they'll say that's what Zionism means. So it's not a term I use to describe myself, but it doesn't mean I'm also not an anti-Zionist, because I believe that Israel has a right to exist. And I think that people have a right to believe in a state that plays a role in the life of the region, but also a state that recognizes that others have a right to live in the region as well, and other people have a right to their own state. So, no, it's not a term that I use to describe my political views. I'm a pragmatist who believes strongly in the right of Israel to exist as a nation. End of sentence.
I hear you, and I thank you for this extended interview. We have so many more questions, but we'll have to wait till we read it in your book. I assume you're writing one.
I am writing a book, but I'm doing so many interviews that I don't have time to do any writing yet. So I'm waiting for the interviews to stop.
You really are. It's amazing. We've tried to interview you for 3-4 years. Global Affairs Canada said no every time. So I'm honored that you were able to do it now. And I thank you for this extended conversation. Thanks for being with us on the CJN's North Star podcast.
Pleasure to talk to you. Thanks.
And that's what Jewish Canada sounded like for this episode of North Star, made possible thanks to the generous support of the Ira Gluskin and Maxine Granovsky-Gluskin Charitable Foundation. Bob Ray has now joined Queen's University as a lecturer. He's also still affiliated with the U of T and with the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. You can watch my full interview on the CJN's YouTube channel. The link is in our show notes. We'd welcome your comments on this episode. You can write at info@thecjn.ca. North Star is produced by Zachary Judah Kaufman. Michael Freeman's the executive producer. Alicia Richler is editorial director. And Brett Higgins wrote our theme. Thanks for listening.